Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Vineyard Missions webinar, where we equip Vineyard churches to participate in the mission of God around the world. We're honored you would join us. Today, we're focusing on the missions-minded church, infusing missions into your church DNA. I'd like to mention a few details for you up front. Okay, we're going to spend about an hour together today, and in the final 10 minutes of our hour, we'll have some time for your questions. We're recording all of this, and it'll be posted to our website for sharing or re-listening afterwards. So today we're going to dive into a panel discussion, and these panelists, they can preach. But today, none of us are going to preach, we promise. We're just sitting around the proverbial coffee table together. So a couple housekeeping notes. In Zoom, there should be buttons on the bottom of your screen. There's a button to raise your hand, a button for chat, and a button for Q&A, so you can ask questions. You're all muted to prevent background noise, but we want interaction. Our webinars work best when we can have a conversation, and we know how distracting it can be when you're sitting at a computer connected to the internet. So everyone stay with us, chat, comment, ask questions as we go. You'll get so much more out of this hour if you're fully present and engaged. To that end, I'd like to start us with a poll question. So we'd like to know, those of you attending here with us, are you a church planter? Are you a lead or senior pastor, a staff pastor, or a missions leader, or something else? And you can type into the chat and let us know what your role is in your church. We'd love to hear from you. I'm going to give us a moment to respond to that. I see responses coming in. So we'll just give it a moment. And while you guys are responding to that, let me just introduce our panelists today. First, we have Gia Downs, who's pastor of the Vineyard in Huntsville, Alabama. And she's also our missions partnership leader for Kenya. We have Jeremy Pleasant, who's the pastor of Vineyard in Baton Rouge, and he is the missions partnership leader for Haiti, and he's also our new co-regional coordinator for the Caribbean region, brand new region, and we're thrilled to have him on the leadership team now. And then finally, we have Tim Mangler, the pastor of Vineyard in Crystal Lake, Illinois, and he's also the missions partnership leader for Mozambique. Thank you three so much for joining us today. All right. Let's see who's responded to our poll here. Okay, I'm going to show this. This is where we're at so far. Do you guys see that? And results are still coming in, but this is where we're at. So we have a lot of staff pastors and mission leaders and others who are chatting. So if you open your chat window, you'll probably be able to see some of that. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with our discussion. All right, let's dive in. So panelists, can you each take about a minute and just share with us a little bit about your church and the role international missions plays? Gia, can we start with you?
Sure. We're a small church in North Alabama. We're right below the Tennessee state line. So our church is heavily influenced by the defense industry, and by that I mean we have a lot of engineers, and we're a bunch of introverts at our church, so we're kind of a quiet bunch, but we have been involved in international missions from day one, and we started out initially with friends that we had that were missionaries from the denomination that we came out of, and so we started with them, and then we found out Vineyard had missions, and so we started interacting with Vineyard missions, started working in Kenya in the early 2000s, and have been traveling back and forth to Kenya since 2007.
It's amazing. Very cool. Thank you. Tim, tell us your story a little bit.
Yeah, my wife and I planted our Vineyard Church here in Northwest Chicago. We planted in 2005, and we got involved with missions pretty quickly. And now, I mean, missions is just a really substantial part of our church. We're actually involved in 2 different partnerships, and we try to travel to both countries and be involved in both areas. At this point, I just can't even imagine what our church would be like if we didn't have that kind of missions involvement. But it's a really significant part of our everyday life and ministry here at the Crystal Lake Vineyard.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Tim. Jeremy, we want to hear from you. What about Baton Rouge?
Yeah, so Baton Rouge Vineyard is a church that's been around since the late 80s. Didn't start out as a vineyard and then transitioned in pretty soon once the movement started advancing in the late 80s, early 90s. And so I have been at the church for about 12 years, and so I transitioned to the senior role of this church. And so I took over an existing, nearly 30-year-old church. And so missions has been a part of this church from the beginning. We started with the Chilean partnership, which as of, I think 2 years ago now, maybe a year ago, has been released as its own Association of Vineyard Churches, which is really exciting as we were a part of that. And so I was here while we were part of the Chile partnership. And since then, we've transitioned about 5 years ago into the Haiti partnership. And it's been a really exciting time. And so it's something that's been a part of our church, as well as something that we're trying to develop more into as we grow.
That's great. That's great.
So our community is really, we're a college town. And so, LSU, SEC, you got Southern, and but we're also a plant town. And so we have a lot of people that come from plant life, a lot of chemical engineers. And so we also have a pretty, so we strive towards a multi-ethnic, diverse church. And so we have people from a lot of backgrounds, both culturally, socioeconomically, and religiously. And so we got a hodgepodge, and we try to, do our best to engage.
That's fantastic. So we have some time in this section. I want to hear from you guys a little bit more about what have you done intentionally to make missions a part of your church life? Like, how do you keep missions on the congregation's mind, and some of the specific strategies you've used? I welcome any of you to contribute to that.
We have a whole section in our church that's devoted just to Kenya. And so there's a lot of pictures, there's things up, it's very clearly marked, but we also make sure that there's a lot of updated pictures of the people that we're working with in Kenya, so that the people in our church actually know them by name. It's not just that we go to Kenya, but they know this person in Kenya and this person in Kenya. And we have had several of them come and visit us in our church. So we've just really worked hard to keep those connections going. We talk about them as if they are, because they are for us, but we talk about them, just like they were with us every Sunday. We talk about what's going on there. We talk about prayer requests. We share prayer requests together. So we've just really tried to incorporate as much as we can into the life of our church.
I love that. Anybody else?
Yeah, we just kind of the same thing. We just talk about it a lot. I'll talk about it a little bit more later when we get to the budget issue, but once a quarter, whenever a month has a fifth Sunday, those 5 Sundays of the month, we take 5 minutes of the service time and we just talk about it. We share pictures, we share videos. But then there is a section of our church where we have lots of things we've brought back from Mozambique and Senegal on display. Anything that's a prayer request or an urgent need or a celebration, baptisms, we send it out in our weekly newsletter, our email newsletter. We put it on our Facebook page. We just talk about it a lot, and we try to keep it in front of people in many different ways. And like Gia said, we really want our people in our church to know the names of some of our key people in Mozambique and Senegal, and they do. And so I think it's just constantly talking about it and constantly keeping it in front of people with fresh pictures, fresh videos, fresh things of celebration or fresh prayer concerns. And then just having those pictures and the other tangible items that we bring back in front of people.
I love that. Both of you have highlighted the importance of making it personal, because it's so easy to just think of a country name and it becomes like an afterthought. But when it's a person's name and a person's story, and like you said, baptisms and what's going on and what they need prayer for, it makes it more a part of your church family. That's really cool. What about you, Jeremy?
Yeah, to add I mean, a lot of what was said already, just something that we do is, just try to share stories. And so whether it's in sermons or kind of somewhere within our liturgy on a Sunday, try to really share some explicit stories that really share the depth of what's happening and both the positive and the negative stuff, and just to share the reality of what's happening, and so people can understand that this, it's not some distant country that we're serving, but friends and family and partners that are actually doing this together. And so the language you use is extremely important as we really want to get a message of not us saving or helping or anything like that, but really more of us actually doing this life together. And so whenever I speak, I say, hey, our Vineyard Church in Cote d'Ivoire, our Vineyard Church and Guadalupe, our Vineyard Church in Gonaive, really talking about these are our sister churches, not these international, foreign communities, but actually our friends and in our family. So
we're walking side by side.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. That's great language.
That does make another point that I thought about after we started talking. We're very careful about what pictures we put up, and we're very careful about what stories we tell. And we make sure that we are talking in that language of brothers and sisters, in Christ, and not we're going to save this country or do this thing, right? But and try to keep things, even when we make pleas for different projects or whatever, we try to keep it unemotional, just factual. Here's what's going on. But we're also very careful when we put pictures up that we have permission from our friends in Kenya to use this particular picture of them in our church or on our Facebook page or wherever, because they're in the part of the world we're working in, there is some sensitivity to only the worst parts of their country being shown around the world.
That is really important. Thanks for highlighting that. And I know that, as far as Vineyard Missions, since the Vineyard works in so many nations, over 60 nations, there's all different levels of security and safety and sensitivity we have to use based on the culture of the nation or the people group. So for instance, there's some nations where we can't really show pictures, or we have to be very careful that they don't get out there on the web or on social media. So I know that I don't think I had thought about it the way you just said, Gia, that the Kenyans would be particularly sensitive to being shown as needy or poor or things looking really bad, because that's what's been shown of their country and been paraded around and been exploited. So that's a really good point to think about, of how different countries have been represented in our media. So this is great. I really appreciate the discussion. I'd love to hear if any of you have found ways to link your international efforts with your local community efforts. Jeremy, you started talking a little bit about that. Can you share your experience in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a unique connection because Louisiana is the only country in the U.S. That was a former French colony, just like the partnership that we're in Haiti. And so we have some similarities culturally with the country we're in. And so while there aren't a ton of Haitians in Baton Rouge, there are a lot of Haitians in New Orleans, which is about an hour south of us. And so what happens is, as we've had a lot of people that have come and visited our church that have engaged with us because they have seen the work that we're doing internationally, and also because they've seen the way that we have been doing it and kind of the heart behind it. A lot of people have commented, really appreciating that we're coming in as partners, which is something that is a little bit not common. We're not the only one, but it's not as common in a place like Haiti. And so that's really helped engage with parts of our local community, our international community, not just Haitians, but others in our church who aren't from the U.S. that have helped them really engage with us. And it's made our community richer since they've been in our church.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Tim, what about you? What has your experience been with the connection between international missions and your local community?
Yeah, we've got a kind of a similar story to Jeremy. This is going back quite a few years ago now, but because we're a church that's heavily involved in 2 different African countries, we're very comfortable and we're very welcoming to African people. And so it's a long story on the front end, but God orchestrated that a African family from Cameroon found their way to our church, and we welcomed them and embraced them and loved on them. And then they just started bringing more and more of their friends and relatives, to the point where at one point we reached a place where we were 35% African. 35% of my church was Black African.
Wow.
The little family that came said something so profound. They said that they had been in the country for about 5 years, and they had been to many other churches where they were rejected, and they had been to many other churches where they were tolerated. Ours was the first church where they were ever openly embraced and welcomed. And because we did that, then they began to bring, like I said, more and more of their friends and relatives. And so we became a voice, almost unintentionally, but we became a voice for racial reconciliation. And, you know, the church, the Vineyard, being every tribe and every tongue and every nation. And so our church speaks really loudly now of that in our community, just by our makeup, just by the fact that we've got Africans in our church. And that's what we're supposed to be about, is every tribe and every tongue and every nation. And then we've even had a few white families join our church just because they loved our focus on missions. So it's just been an absolute blessing to see what the Lord has done through our missions efforts here locally and bringing people to the church.
Wow, that's amazing. And just, I mean, what a statement that they had been tolerated or rejected, and kudos to what God has done in your church, that they were welcome.
They would show up wanting to wear their Sunday best culturally. So that they show up wearing African clothing, and that's very different than U.S. clothing. And we loved it. We celebrated it. We absolutely celebrated it. And they love to bring their African food to our potlucks, and they love to sing their African songs, and we embraced all of that because it just makes us richer.
Oh, absolutely. And it sounds like a lot of cultural intelligence in your church, which is wonderful, something we can all grow in. And I love that. That's such a beautiful story of these families being loved and welcomed hospitably and in your community. That's wonderful. So I'd like to take a quick pause and just ask another poll question for those of you who are attending with us. I'd love to know if you have some folks in your community that come from other nations. As we, I'm sorry, I have the wrong question up. Well, we'll get to that. I will put that up momentarily, but I would love to hear if you have people in your community that come from other nations, if you have immigrants, or if you're a more monocultural area of the country. But in the meantime, while I move on to this, I have heard lots of different ways that churches have budgeted for international missions. And I'd love to hear from you three about your missions budgets and your thoughts on why this is important. So Jeremy, could we start with you on that?
Yeah, so our missions budget has changed. And so we have a church, I mentioned size only because it matters in context of budget, not for any other reason, of just around 200. And so we're kind of at an interesting space of, you know, just with staff and we've had a building for 20 years that, you know, and so all of those responsibilities, and yet really trying to move our budget towards to about 10% is really our goal right now. And so within that's looking at all of our outreach focused activities, both domestically or internationally, and really helping people, really helping to disciple people towards that, as well as trying to make it a focus in our regular everyday life. And so what that looks like is, so we have our set budget, which is based on our income, but then also providing more opportunities for people to give, whether it's through special offerings, but also through something that we're trying this year, which is we're going to set up some fundraising opportunities through actually purchasing items from Haitian-owned businesses, which is going to help generate some income as well. So it both supports the Haitians we're working with locally, but also helps supports the funding of the partnership to help do some more things that we're trying to get going.
Awesome, thank you. And Gia, what about the budget experience of your church?
Well, for us, we are co-vocational. So when we started, I mentioned earlier, talking to you, we sort of accidentally planted our church. We thought someone else was going to come in and was being trained to come in and take it over. And that was about 20 years ago. So either they're still training them or, it's us. But we were able to start out from the beginning with a pretty big chunk of our budget going to missions. And it stays, and this is just international missions. This is not outreaches locally or things that we do in our local community. But internationally, it stays at a pretty solid 10% of our budget every year. And then we also do special offerings if a need comes up that would be outside of the 10%. Recently, we did some things for an area of famine in Kenya. The need for that was well over our 10%. So we just put that out there. And just let people give to those things as they want. We've done different things over the years. We have brought in, we brought in nativity sets several years ago that were handmade in Kenya, and we sold those, and used the difference for that. After you've worked in a country for a long time, you have a lot of connections. We have other friends in the area that we can meet halfway, and we can help, ferry things back and forth without having to pay a lot of shipping. So we just do all different kinds of creative things. We've had meals, probably like you all have had. We do a lot of different things. I think the most important thing, though, for any church, anything that you want to be built into the DNA of your church, it has to be done. It doesn't have to be done. It's best if you're a church planter, if it's done from the beginning, from day one. Then people don't really question it later. It's just part of the DNA of who you are. I think if you're building it into your church, from people that I've talked to, it's you sort of start slow and you work toward it. You have a goal. I love Jeremy said, I think earlier they have a goal and they're working toward that. And I think you just let people know we're going to incrementally work toward this, and you talk about why it's important, why international missions are important. But if you're just planting or if you're just starting out, you get a lot of buy-in if you just start out this way.
Yeah, it's a given. The default of the church is to make this a priority in the budget and in what we do on Sundays and how we interact and everything. Yeah. Tim, what about your budget? How does this work in your church?
Yeah. Again, we're in two partnerships. We're in Senegal and Mozambique, and we treat them slightly differently. In Senegal, early on, we had committed to a base monthly amount. It wasn't percentage of budget. It was just a base monthly amount. That amount is now up to $700 a month. So minimum commitment every month, Senegal, $700. Then beyond that, mostly what we do is special offerings. Again, whenever there's a month with the fifth Sunday, we talk about missions a little bit more throughout that month. And then throughout the month, we always just encourage people to pray and consider how they might financially partner with what we're doing. And those quarterly offerings are usually pretty substantial. I've always been sort of shocked by just how much money comes in through those offerings. And so then we separate those offerings between the Senegal account and the Mozambique account, and then send additional monies to each country as needed. So coming out of general budget, it's just that $700 a month. Everything else is through special offerings.
Yeah.
Now, we also do some things that both Jeremy and Gia mentioned is we do have an African store in the church. In Mozambique, we've started a sewing school. We've partnered with another Vineyard NGO that's working in Mozambique to help bring up a sewing school. And so as these ladies are brought in off the street and trained on how to sew products, then we get those products to the U.S. by hook or crook. And then we sell all of these fabric products, everything from bags and purses to aprons and all this kind of stuff. And so then we raise a little bit of money that way. And whenever we make a trip, as I think Gia mentioned, whenever we make a trip to either Senegal or Mozambique, we bring back handmade goods as well that we sell. But for the most part, the money comes through special offerings.
Wonderful. And what can you give us some examples? Any of you, can you give us some examples of what a special offering might look like in your church? Because I know every partnership's a little different in the type of needs, but I'd love to hear some examples of things you've raised money for in the past. Anybody can start.
Yeah. So one thing. Go ahead.
For us, just recently, Mozambique, you may have heard in the news, was hit by 2 massive cyclones. The 2 worst cyclones to ever hit the Southern Hemisphere. And so that was easy because it was in the news and people were hearing about it. And so we just said, hey, we've got 12 churches that are directly affected by the cyclone. They need to rebuild. And so specifically, we raised money for the rebuilding of churches. Normally, it's more specific needs of like, hey, we've got this one church that's doing great. They're really moving along well, but they're just having troubles coming up with a little extra money to put the roof on their building. Can we help them with the tin sheets for the roof? And so we'll raise money for a specific church, just maybe for the roofing material or something like that.
That's great. What about you two?
I think for us, it's changed a little bit because Kenya is a released AVC. So we've tried to move away from local churches and move more toward the AVC as a whole. So we tend to respond now more to things that are in the country. Like I mentioned, the famine. AVC Kenya wanted to respond to the famine. We were able to come along and partner with them and help do that. But we do still have, because over the years you become connected to certain people. You just do. And so we've had medical issues, church building issues. One of our churches, before I transitioned to this position, we were just attached to one local church primarily. The government decided to bulldoze their building. They decided to put a road in, and that seems bizarre to us, but it's pretty common in some of these countries. And so we were able to help raise, in 1 week, we were able to raise enough money for them to rent a building for a year, because they literally were given about 6 hours notice that their church was going to be bulldozed. And so they pulled everything out, so it's very different things. I mean, it's just a huge variety, of things that you can. We're trying to get away from projects or sustaining projects, and work more just through the local leadership.
Yeah. Great perspective. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't even mention, that's right. Gia is the partnership leader for Kenya, which a few years ago was released as their own association. And so she's in the unique position of transitioning a partnership from a different level of supporting role. And I'm sure it's been an interesting journey for you guys.
That's one way to put it.
Just trying to find your place as part of the partnership, and how do we support and yet not create any kind of dependency that doesn't help them to thrive on their own. So I know it can be tricky, and culturally it can be tricky as well. Jeremy, what about you? Share with us. Share with us in this regard. So
2 quick instances. So one, I mean, this is like this in most missions that we're involved in as a group, but specifically in Haiti, we have to be super careful with money and how we handle money. And so recently we began fundraising for a business that we're trying to get started, starting to develop in the central region, that we hope is going to help create some jobs and generate some income in the area. And so was able to get some money raised for that. And so a lot of those kind of, when we have very specific projects we're working on, it's usually a lot easier to kind of get special offerings and money raised for that. One of our partner churches on the East Coast was able to raise all the money we needed for a school we're starting in one go of it. And so it was very quick. And then recently, about a month ago, one of our senior leaders in Haiti, his wife had a serious medical issue, and that was just really, really unfortunate. And he had to take on some serious medical debt to cover the costs, but it wasn't much in U.S. dollars, especially given the conversion rate right now with everything that's happening in Haiti. And so I was able to make a couple calls, and raise that money in about 30 minutes. And so it's just one of those things where it's just, for specific things and as things come up, regularly, we're able to move forward with it a little more easily.
That's great. Thank you guys. Such a diversity of examples of ways that your churches are giving. So to that end, I'd like to ask the audience, do you have international missions as a line item in your church? So if you'll just take a moment and let us know, we'd love to hear your responses to that, if you have international missions as a line item in your church already. And I really appreciate how we've gotten to hear these 3 different ways of looking at it. And so something that Gia really started to hone in on, and I'd like to push in a little deeper, is the importance of missions from the beginning of your church. So panelists, for our church planters who may be listening or may listen to the recording, was missions part of the focus at the beginning of your church, and what did that look like for you? So Tim, let's start with you.
Yeah. Missions wasn't necessarily apart from day one, but it was very quick. Very early on, I was in a small group of Vineyard pastors, a monthly small group of Vineyard pastors. Another pastor in that group encouraged me to get involved in missions right away, and so we did. And so it wasn't day one, but it was pretty quick. It was probably in the 2nd year of existence as a church, we got involved in missions. And as Gia mentioned, it does make it so much easier on that front end to just incorporate it into your DNA. And so initially for us, what that meant is, seriously, he invited us into the Senegal partnership. At that point in my life, I didn't know where Senegal was. I had to get on a map and find it. Where is this place, Senegal? And so initially what it was for us is prayer. They would keep us updated on the various needs and activities there. And so we would pray for them on a regular basis. And I think at that point in our church, we committed to sending $50 a month. But we even got the kids involved. We would have the kids bring in loose change, bring in their pennies and dimes and nickels and stuff like that. And we would have them take pictures of the children in Senegal, and we would put those pictures up in our children's ministry area and vice versa. So the children were involved. But initially it was just prayer and $50 a month. And then it just kept growing and growing as our church grew. The missions activity and just continued to grow.
That's amazing. Gia, now I know you and your husband planted your church. Would you share a little bit about how that happened, that missions was a part of it from the beginning?
Well, that's, you may be sorry you asked this question.
Oh no, I want to hear it.
when David and I first got married, or getting married 35 plus years ago, we asked each other to promise 2 things. One, I asked him to promise me that we'd never be pastors. And he asked me to promise him that we'd never go travel internationally for missions. And we both agreed, and I'm pretty sure God laughed. But we both agreed to that. And so once we broke the first one, we were pastors, then the opportunity came up and we got involved with the Kenya partnership. And so at first, David was all on board, except he said, we will send money, we will not go. And I said, okay, that's fine. So we did that for several years, kept being invited. And then one day in worship, I had some health issues that I won't go into now, but I had always told God, if you'll take care of this health issue, I'll go to Kenya. And I felt like he very clearly one day in in worship, said, when it comes to missions, if you'll go, I'll take care of you.
Wow.
And then we had someone else prophetically just turn to me out of the blue that did not know me in a meeting, just turn around and say, you need to get your passport. And so in 2007, my daughter and I took a trip to Kenya with Bubba. Before I got on the plane, I had an almost complete full-blown panic attack. But because I had my, at the time, 20-year-old daughter with me, I'm like, okay, I have to be tough and get through it. So I did. And the first time I called home from Kenya, and it's a very different place now, just in 10, 12 years. But the very first time I called home from Kenya, communication was pretty sketchy back home, pretty, here and there. And my husband said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm great. I absolutely fell in love with this country the minute my feet hit the ground." And he said, who can hear you? And I said, "Nobody, I'm outside." And he said, "Are you sure you're alone? Are you okay? We should have had a code word because I'm not sure you're okay." And so I was fine. I absolutely fell in love. Took him back the next year with us. His very first night, he was laying in bed and he said, "God, I promise you, if you'll get me out of this country, I'll never come back again." Some pretty funny things happened that happened right before. A monkey jumped in his face in the bathroom. And anyway, that's a whole nother story. But after that monkey in the bathroom, he was like, "That's it. I'm out of here. I'll never come back again." And then he said the next morning, God just did a complete transformation in his heart, and we love it. We feel very much at home there. I share that story just to say, if you keep saying yes to God, you will go places you never thought you'd go. You'll do things you never thought you'd do, and life will be amazing most of the time.
I suspect that all three of you have some really, really good stories. That's for another day, but man, I can only imagine. And Gia mentioned Bubba. For those of you who don't know, Bubba Justice, our now national coordinator, was actually the Kenya partnership leader before Gia. So that's who she went on that trip with. And actually, Gia, we have your story featured in one of our videos on our YouTube channel. And I love that video of you telling the story of having your heart captured by Kenya. And I think in that video, we even have some pictures of your Kenya area and your church, the wall where you have pictures. And so if anyone wants to see more about that, I'll post the address to our YouTube channel in a little bit. That's great. But let me ask this question. Here's another poll question. Let's see. So in our time together so far, I'd love to know if you've heard something that's given you a new idea or two. This is for our attendees. Have you heard anything yet? Man, all the yeses are coming in really fast. So see, you three are giving us a lot to chew on, and we love hearing your experiences and how things work in your church. So thank you for being here and for sharing. So I want to hear from each of you, and we have plenty of time. I don't want you to feel rushed. I want each of you to share, to those who are in existing churches, not plants, but what would you say to someone who's well aware that missions isn't a priority or part of the culture of their church, but they want to change that, when they want to turn the ship around? Where would you suggest they start? Let's start with Jeremy on this one.
So I say the first part of that, for me to answer, it really depends on your position of power and authority. So having been an associate pastor, I know what it's like to have influence without actually necessarily the power to always exert that influence. And so I think a lot of it depends on just where you're positioned. And so first, let me just speak to those who are senior pastors or planters who are a couple years in. It's going to start to happen as it becomes embedded. And first, your own development and your own kind of the work you're doing, just kind of as you're developing, because it after a while it begins to just kind of flow out of you in conversations and sermons, and the way you're designing small groups and all of these things, when it's something that you're engaged with regularly. And so I think a culture shift happens as a culture shift happens within you. And so start looking at books. I mean, we can, the four of us right now can rattle off 10, 15 books, but just to start with, of saying, okay, I want to study this. I want to understand this, begin seeking and praying. What's really important is say, okay, God, where are you calling us to? I think one of the struggles is, I mean, you can look at a map of the world and pick any one place that could use, that you want to work in, but really having a narrow focus and saying, okay, God is calling us here, to kind of go from, hey, we're supporting and sending people out to all of these different areas, to saying, okay, God is calling us here. And then just really spending time developing, saying, okay, what do I need to learn? How do I understand what it's like in this particular place? How do I begin to do the work of myself to understand my own advantages and what that means from a U.S. perspective? How do I begin to actually redevelop my theology and around what it means to work cross-culturally? How do I begin to understand and become more competent cross-culturally is really important. And so as that begins to happen, that's just going to naturally change your conversations with staff and with the church and in everything you do. And to me, that's going to be one of the critical starting points to shifting that culture. Obviously, there's more than that, and Tim and Gio will speak to that. But for me, I have found that when it comes to working cross-culturally, when it comes to working internationally, it's going to start with actually first stopping and saying, okay, I need to learn. I need to grow here. I need to really challenge all of my assumptions because we all have them. And as that happens, not only does your heart grow and more compassion develop, then you begin to say, okay, I actually don't know as much as I thought as I did. And now I want to do this more. Like I want to jump into this more. I want to dive into this more. And it really begins to shift in your own heart. And then where that shifts, then everything else follows, in my experience, as limited as it is. And so
that's great.
I would say for associates, for those who don't have the last, word per se in your community, it's going to start with, obviously we have the phrase in the Vineyard, everyone gets to play, right? And so, but really having that conversation with your senior leader and saying, hey, I'd like to talk more about this and begin to explore this. Can you give me some freedom here? And just begin taking those steps. Reach out to the partnership leader. And, same thing, finding a country that you're really discerning and praying about and say, hey, can we go on a trip, just a couple of us, and explore? That's what happened with us in Haiti, is like we just explored. And bring your senior leader along, and generally you'll start to see something happen on that exploration trip as you're praying and discerning, and that can really help tip the scales and tip the direction of where you're trying to go.
That's great, Jeremy. Thank you. And I love the focus on our heart condition and our own knowledge and awareness of our biases. And something that Mark Fields has said, our missions director, he said, we can always be chasing the needs. The needs are always out there. And some churches get stuck in the putting out fires around the world and these different needs that are presented to them. But when we make a big impact, it is through strategic and focused efforts in one or two nations. Obviously larger churches can do a little more, but that strategic focus, and that's the beauty of partnership, is it allows any size church to play in this bigger thing that God is doing in a nation. So we have lots of resources to that end that I will again share with you when I share the recording of this with the attendees here. I would really encourage you to look into, if you're not currently in a partnership, start turning the ship towards that strategic long-term focus in a nation. And then your short-term trips fall under that path. So enough of me. Gia and Tim, tell us a little bit about what you would recommend, maybe a couple tips for people in how to start making missions more part of their church culture. Gia, why don't we start with you?
I loved one of the things that Jeremy said. He said, get yourself in a position to learn. And I think that's huge. I think having that shift in your church, that you're not taking God somewhere, he's already there working. Your job is to try and discern what he's doing and where you're supposed to partner with him and with the local people on the ground. I think, it's also big to connect with partnership leaders, connect with people who have already been there, listen. I think new and fresh ideas are always encouraged, and we need those, but there's also some pitfalls and some things that can be avoided if you're willing to listen to people that have gone before you. You don't have to reinvent the wheel in your country. But I think the best thing you can do is a boots on the ground trip, and get as many people involved in that as you can, or even if it's just your senior pastor. I think getting buy-in from the senior leader at your church is something that is just hugely important, very critical. If you don't have buy-in from the senior, it's going to always be pushing a rock uphill. So I think just getting those key people, one or two key people to do a boots on the ground. We're just going to observe, to hang out, to pray, to learn, to meet, I think is critically important. And it's also critically important to do a lot of training that's what you're doing, and be very clear about what that short-term trip is, the goal of it, and what it's about.
Yeah,
or you'll have people frustrated that you're not actually doing something they can see with their hands.
Yeah, especially if they're used to a certain model of short-term trip. And this model of partnership with a nation is very relational, very long-term. It's not always projects. It's not always preaching. It's different for every partnership and every trip. And that's good advice. And before we go to Tim, just a side note, from me, someone who I've been a pastor but is not currently a pastor, for those of you in our audience that aren't pastors, a good place to start is to start praying, God, what do you see as my role in this? You've given me this heart for a people or for missions in general. What do I do with this heart? What role can I play in inspiring our church? And I believe Jeremy mentioned it, Gia mentioned it, having these conversations with your lead pastor and the others on your staff. But there's something to be said about the layperson champion who can be that person in the congregation that is championing what the church is doing in missions. And in my new church, that's my role, is I want to champion our partnership. Because my lead pastor, lead pastors are torn in, you guys know how many different directions, 1 million different directions. And to have someone in your congregation or someone's who can champion this is really powerful. So if you're not a lead pastor, which I think most of our audience is not, don't minimize your part in having a voice and having an effect and an impact in your church. You definitely can. And a lot of times the pastor will welcome it because they are so divided. So would I be accurate in that, you guys?
Yeah, for sure.
So Tim, share with us a little bit from your perspective.
Yeah, I want to share 4 thoughts on this, and then ultimately it's a hard issue. And I think both Gia and Jerry already mentioned that, but it's a hard issue, and I'll share a story related to that. But my first thought is, okay, so my church isn't involved in missions. How do we get there? I think it starts with theology, which is what Jeremy talked about. We have to understand that we all are called to the Great Commission. Jesus said, go to all the nations and make disciples, and we all have a responsibility to that. And so it really starts with a good fundamental understanding of our role in the Great Commission, and we just don't get to opt out of that one. We don't get to play that opt-out card. We've got to have a role in that. And then the second piece, I think, is obedience. God will be speaking to you. Once you understand that the Great Commission is for you, God will start to speak to you somehow, some way, and then there's a role of obedience to play in that. For me, the obedience was in that invitation. I was in this small group of pastors with another Vineyard pastor. He invited me into the Senegal partnership, and I really kind of felt like the Lord was tugging on that heartstring. And so there was an obedience factor. I had to say, yes, Lord, I'm gonna do this. And then a couple years into that same pastor then invited me to go to Senegal to the first time. And again, I didn't even know where Senegal was initially. So there was a bit of a fear factor there initially. But again, there was obedience. So now there's this invitation to go to this country. And so I had to be obedient. I had to say, okay, yes, Lord, I'll go visit this country. In fact, we were going to visit 2 countries on that trip. We were going to go to Senegal and Tanzania. And I want to share a quick story here as a point to this obedience thing. Money follows obedience. When we're obedient to God, He will provide the funds that we need. A friend of mine always says God pays for what He orders. And so after this friend invited me to go on this first trip to Senegal and Tanzania, I was wanting to be obedient, but I kind of dismissed it because I didn't have the money, right? Well, we don't have the money, blah, blah, blah. So the Lord brought a first-time visitor into our church who heard me talking about this invitation to go to Senegal for the first time. And to make a long story short, he came up afterward and presented me with a check for $50,000 and told me to go on that trip.
Wow.
I found that to be true every single time since. Money follows obedience. So we start with understanding the commission, then we move to obedience. Money will follow the obedience, but then it's the heart. At some point, God's got to get a hold of our heart. So I go to Senegal for the first time, and I was somewhat unprepared for the spiritual darkness, the levels of pollution, and it's a little bit different than Chicago. And so one day I'm standing on the roof of our building there. All the buildings there have flat roofs, and so life kind of happens on the roof. And I'm standing on the roof of this building one day, maybe 2 or 3 days into the trip, and I said out loud, I said, Lord, I hate it here. And He replied, He said, I hate it too. That's why you're here. And in that instant, He broke my heart for Senegal and for the African continent. But from that moment on, I love the place, and I can't wait to get back, and I enjoy every minute of being in Senegal and Mozambique and all the other countries I've been to. But it's got to get to that point where God gets a hold of your heart and He breaks your heart for a people or for a nation. Because before that, you might just be going through the motions, or you might just be doing it because somebody asked you to do it. And it's not really going to connect, and it's not really going to be God powerful until He's got a hold of your heart and He breaks your heart for a nation. And it only has to happen to one person. If your church isn't involved in missions, but you get one person, whether it's just a lay person, an associate, or the senior leader, if they go and they get their heart broken, that's contagious when they come back home, and it'll transfer through the rest of the church.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tim. That's so good. Jeremy, did you have a story you wanted to share as well?
Yeah, and I'll try to be quick because I know we need to get to some Q&A. Everyone that I know who took a team trip just about anywhere, but especially what we focused on in Haiti, they always say the same thing. Hey, we come back and our lives are changed more than we've changed the lives of people that we were working with and whatever country. And so we specifically, about a year and a half ago, we took a team trip, and we were doing some work in multiple areas. And one of the women in our group who came with us for the first time, who's been at our church for maybe a year, said, hey, I want to go on this trip. She was 19 years old. She had saved up the money. I was like, great, let's go. During that week, her heart is broken by just everything that she is seeing, but also just full of hope by everything that was going on, mostly by the children she was working with. So she comes back and immediately says, Jeremy, I want to join our internship. And then joins our internship, and then starts serving and volunteering in all these different ways, and is now one of our senior leaders in our church. I mean, from being at church for 9 months or so, not engaged at all, to within a year, a critical part of our team. And not just looking at how much is a part of our team, but just looking at it from the sake of discipleship. And that's one thing to look at as far as infusing this within the DNA, as far as making this sell to your senior leaders and to the church. Like, this is a key piece of what it means to make a disciple. And I think as we do that, and if we can do that, we start to see people's lives completely transformed, not just in the areas we're working in, but in our local church.
So good. And I've heard other partnership leaders as well share stories like that, where their church back home has been so impacted by what takes place on these trips, and their local community has been impacted, and it just ripples out from there, because when God's on the move, you can't really stop it. So it's gonna go everywhere. A couple quick things. I posted some resources, and I did it a little early because I don't want anybody to leave and not have these resources. But I do want to open us up for a few minutes of questions. So if you have any questions for our three amazing panelists, if you could submit them in the question box right now. I've got Chris next to me here kind of monitoring that and seeing what comes in. And we'll just take a few minutes for that. And while those come in, I'll share with you the resources that I posted. So first of all, our partnership leaders all come together in Colorado Springs every year for a time of refreshing and training and inspiration. And it's called a missions leaders meeting. And we've been doing it for years and years. And the cool thing is, just because of technology, the last few years, we've been able to live stream this. So I would like to encourage whoever is out there and whoever listens to this to get access to that, because it is an amazing week. There are amazing topics and speakers, and all three of these guys here are always such a big part of this event, and it is like a family reunion we all get to enjoy. But I would just encourage you to keep an eye on our Facebook page. We'll be live streaming the whole thing through Facebook Live and through our website. So more information coming soon, but keep an eye for that. And that's the first week of October. This year's, it starts September 30th and goes through October 3rd. And boy, so much value, so much value. So I would encourage you to keep an eye on that. And then I also gave you the link to our Facebook page, which we post things on there constantly. And then if you as a church just want to get your hands on some resources, we have like a bucket of resources, and we're always creating more. And a quick way to get there, instead of having this long extended web page, is just go to vmresources.org. vmresources.org, and you'll see a cool list of some things that you have access to that might help you in your church. And then finally, I just love to point people to both our YouTube page and our web page. On our web, on the home page, is actually a list of all of the nations where there's work going on in the Vineyard. And so you can also look for more information on that. You could connect with the leaders. And so I would encourage you to go there. And then I gave you the URL for our YouTube page. And on there, you'll see Gia's video, the video about the Kenya partnership, and some other great videos. So it doesn't look like we have any questions. We have 2 minutes. Would any of the three of you like to say anything else, anything that's come up for you? I do have one question that just came in. It came in the chat.
Yeah, I'm seeing that.
Vineyard Missions, is it just USA Vineyards? Is there a branch for non-English speakers? Great question. So when we talk about Vineyard Missions, from my perspective, Chris's perspective, our office, we are Vineyard USA Missions, but quite a few of our partnerships work across various associations. I know, Gia, your partnership is across associations, correct?
It was, again, once an AVC is released, it's a little different.
That's true. That's true. Now it is literally two ABCs working together.
Mozambique is in 3 countries. Mozambique, we've got also South Africa and Brazil that partner with the U.S. So there are 3 of us working in Mozambique.
Wonderful.
So the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, Vanessa, but the question I'd be asking is for those in the U.S. that are non-English speakers.
Yep, that was the second part of the question. Go ahead, Jeremy.
And so actually, she's from Chile. And so, yes, so actually, we do have partners in Chile. And so, just like they were saying, that do connect together. And so it's really just reaching out to that partnership leader and connecting those 2 countries together. Because we do work amongst other associations. And so, UK, other parts of the world. And so for you, looking at the country you want to work in, or just really connecting with Christy on where you want to go, she can connect you with the right person. And that's definitely definitely a thing we do.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, a great answer, Jeremy. A great thing you can do if you have any questions after we log off here is email office@vmteam.org. I'm going to type that in the chat right now. And you can really reach out to us about just about anything if we didn't answer any of your questions that come up after this. And then this other question, let's see.
From Douglas.
That I just want to address really fast. Doug, you said from a U.S. church's perspective, what would you consider makes a successful short-term missions trip? What do you as the pastor leader want to get out of it? Okay, Doug, that is an amazing question, way beyond the scope of this, but what you're doing is giving me the idea for the next webinar. So thank you. So I just wanted to tell you thank you, because I think it would be a great webinar is what makes a great short-term trip. So thank you for that suggestion. And if you do have any questions that we can answer via email, we're happy to do that. But I love that topic as something to push into for a whole hour. Anything else? I really appreciate everybody coming today, and those of you who listen after it's recorded. I just want to extend my thanks to our panel. You all have taken out a couple hours out of your time, and you've taken lots of time to think about this. And your contributions, not only to missions, but just to the kingdom in general and your churches, are just really, really appreciated and seen. So thank you for making the time to be part of this. There are so many more things we could talk about with the three of these people. So if you want to connect with them, email our office and we'll connect you with them. Like I mentioned, the recording and all the resources, we'll send those out to you in a few days, attendees, and we'll also post them on our website. So with that, Jeremy, would you mind closing us in prayer?
Absolutely. Father, we thank you that you are a God that desires so much for shalom for the entire world, for your entire world, for all your people, and that you have called all of us as your children and as your followers to be a part of what you're doing. And so I ask that you continue to equip us, to guide us, to bring us insight into all of this. I pray and thank you for all the attendees that as this sparks something in their hearts and their lives and in their local churches, you will just ignite that spark, that you will provide a pathway and a road for them to continue to pursue what you are doing, that you will make the way easy, and that you will bring light to what you are calling them to, that you remove all resistance, and that you will take what was done today and just amplify it. We're so grateful for who you are and for the mission that you put in front of us. And we just ask that you continue to provide in every single way to make this reality for all of those who are pursuing this. We're so grateful. We're so thankful. And we just ask for your grace to continue on this journey with you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you guys so much. We'll be in touch soon, and we really appreciate your time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.